The afternoon light over Wembley Stadium had turned golden. 82,000 people had been standing for hours in the July heat, and the air smelled like summer and sweat and something larger than both. The weight of a day that everyone present could sense was becoming history in real time. David Bowie had just walked off stage. He stood at the side of the stage, still buzzing, still coming down from the rare white-hot altitude of a performance that had gone exactly right. He'd opened with TVC-15. He'd played Rebel Rebel. He'd sung Heroes to 82,000 people who had screamed back every word. His band was still collecting themselves. His road manager was speaking into a walkie-talkie. Somewhere behind him, a technician was coiling a cable with practiced precision. Bowie was 43 years old. He had been doing this for 20 years. He knew, in the way that only true veterans know, when a performance had crossed the line from good into something else entirely. Today had crossed that line. He could feel it in the particular looseness in his shoulders, in the way his mind had already drifted toward the quiet pleasure of whatever came next. If you'd asked him in that specific moment whether anything could break through the warm, satisfied armor of that feeling, he probably would have smiled and said no. He would have been wrong. Whitney Houston was 21 years old that day. To understand what that means, you have to understand what she was and what she wasn't yet. Her debut album had been out for 7 months. It had gone platinum. It had produced Saving All My Love for You, a song so elegant and technically precise that radio programmers across the country had initially assumed it was a seasoned veteran. They were stunned when they learned she was barely old enough to rent a car. But the world was still calibrating, still figuring out what Whitney Houston actually was. Clive Davis had signed her. That meant something. But even within Arista, there were people who whispered about potential rather than certainty. A voice is one thing. A performer, the kind who could hold 82,000 people, the kind who could stand on a stage so historically charged that even the sky seemed to be paying attention. That was something else entirely. She hadn't proven that yet. She was backstage waiting for her slot, doing what young performers do when the nerves are real and the stakes feel impossibly high, moving, breathing through her nose, slowly, the way her mother Sissy had taught her. The technique learned not in formal vocal training, but in the pews of New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, where the Holy Spirit was not a metaphor, but a presence, and where her mother had stood before congregations and opened something up inside a room that mere talent alone could never reach. Whitney's handlers were nearby. Her microphone had been checked and checked again. Everything was in order. And then she turned, and David Bowie was standing a few feet away. What do you say to David Bowie at Live Aid? Most 21-year-olds would have been frozen. Most veterans would have defaulted to the choreography of mutual recognition. The knowing nod, the handshake, the professional courtesies that keep large events moving. Bowie was not a man who invited casual intimacy. He was, even in person, a construction. Brilliant and deliberate, every element of his public self chosen rather than revealed. The thin white duke, the starman. He had reinvented himself so many times the reinventions had become their own mythology. He spoke to her first. Something brief, polite. The sort of thing you say to a young artist whose moment you can see approaching, but hasn't fully arrived yet. Welcoming, measured. Whitney smiled, and then she sang. Not a performance, not an announcement. There was no preamble, no breath before a formal entrance into a song. It was more instinctive than that, more reflex than calculation. The way a river doesn't decide to move around a rock, it simply moves. She sang a cappella, no microphone, no instrument, no backing, no net. Just her voice in the open air of the Wembley backstage, a few feet from a man who had spent his entire career making sure every element of every moment was architected to precision. What she sang in those few measures doesn't matter as much as how she sang it. There are voices that impress you. There are voices that move you. And then, very rarely, there are voices that do something different, something that doesn't have a clean technical name, something that rearranges the air in a room, that makes the space between sounds feel weighted and alive, that reaches into some pre-rational part of the brain and simply stops it. Not with volume, not with acrobatics, with truth. with a depth of feeling so unadorned and complete that your nervous system registers it before your mind can catch up. David Bowie stopped. The people nearby noticed. There were 3 or 4 of them. A crew member, one of Bowie's musicians, possibly a photographer whose name history hasn't preserved. They noticed because David Bowie's stillness was not ordinary stillness. This wasn't the stillness of a man listening politely. This was the stillness of a man who had been stopped by something. He didn't speak. He didn't move. His face did something that people who worked with him for years said they almost never saw. It became completely unguarded. The architecture came down. Not for long, just for those seconds, for the duration of what she was singing. The very careful, very considered construction of David Bowie was simply not there. What was there instead was something like wonder, or recognition, or the specific humbling sensation of encountering something that exceeds the category you had prepared for it. Whitney finished. The moment passed. Bowie looked at her for a beat too long to be casual. Then he nodded. A single slow nod that meant nothing if you were just glancing over, and everything if you understood what it was replacing. He walked away. Whitney walked toward the stage, and 82,000 people were about to have their afternoon changed forever. She walked out into that gold July light, and the crowd received her with the warm but uncertain applause of an audience that knows a name but hasn't yet surrendered to it, the polite welcome of people willing to be convinced. She opened her mouth. What happened over the next several minutes is documented. There are photographs of the faces in the crowd, shifting from attentiveness to something beyond attentiveness. The particular expression of people who have stopped thinking and started feeling in that involuntary, helpless way that only happens when art is operating at its highest register. She didn't oversell it. She didn't work for the applause. She just sang. Fully, completely, without reservation, the way she had been trained not by any commercial enterprise but by the church, by the tradition of a music that was always, at its root, about something larger than the performer. The crowd went from warm to thunderous, not gradually, in the way that a pressure builds and then releases, the whole thing at once, 82,000 people arriving simultaneously at the recognition that they were watching something they would remember. David Bowie was backstage when it happened. He could hear it without seeing it. The shift in the crowd's sound, the particular frequency change that any experienced performer reads as instinctively as a sailor reads weather. He knew what that sound meant. He stood there and listened to it happening. Later, not that day, not in any formal interview, but in the way that real things get passed from person to person over time. He said something to someone in his circle, a single sentence, said in the tone of a man speaking to himself as much as to anyone else. I controlled the stage. She became the stage. 7 words. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. Because what he'd understood in those backstage seconds when her voice had stopped him cold was something that his entire career had been built on doing rather than feeling. Bowie's genius was construction. Every performance was architecture. Every moment was chosen. The artifice was the art. What Whitney Houston had was its opposite. It wasn't constructed. It couldn't be constructed. It was a kind of nakedness, an unguarded transmission that bypassed every mechanism of taste and judgment and landed somewhere deeper and more essential. It was the thing that the church had always known about, and that the music industry was always trying to bottle and never quite could. 21 years old, 7 months into a career that Clive Davis had shaped with extraordinary precision. The wardrobe, the arrangements, the pop sheen, the careful calibration of a sound sophisticated enough for adults and accessible enough for radio. Whitney had been trained, not just vocally but professionally, to present herself in a particular way, to be the voice in the frame, the instrument inside the machine. What she'd done backstage, singing without announcement, without framing, without the apparatus, was not the product. The product was polished and perfect and radio ready. What she'd done backstage was something she'd grown up doing in church, something that came from a place that predated the record deal and the stylists and the arista machinery. Sissy Houston's daughter, the granddaughter of gospel singer Delia Mae Juanita Murphy. The child who had grown up watching her mother stand before a congregation and open something up in a room that technical mastery alone could not touch. That was what had stopped David Bowie. Not the technique, though the technique was immaculate. Not the range, though the range was extraordinary, but the source of it, the thing underneath the instrument, the place it was coming from. She carried all of that out onto the Live Aid stage. All of the expectation, Clive's, Arista's, the industry's, her mother's, her own. All of the weight of a career, still in its opening chapter, still under judgment, still in the process of being measured and classified. She carried it out, and she set it down, and she sang. Not for them, through them, maybe, or for something she couldn't name and didn't need to. The legacy of that afternoon would take years to fully understand. By the end of 1985, Saving All My Love for You had reached #1 in multiple countries. By 1991, she would stand at the Super Bowl and deliver a rendition of The Star-Spangled Banner, still considered by many to be the definitive performance of that song in modern American history. By 1992, she would record I Will Always Love You in a version that Dolly Parton, who wrote the song, called the greatest gift anyone had ever given her music. None of that was knowable on July 13, 1985. What was knowable was this. A 21-year-old woman from Newark, New Jersey, walked onto a stage in front of 82,000 people with the weight of every expectation that had ever been placed on her, and she answered it in the only way that actually worked. Not by living up to it, but by ignoring it. By going somewhere else entirely. By going home, in the deepest sense of the word. David Bowie understood that. Standing backstage, listening to the crowd's temperature shift, he understood it the way a craftsman understands when he has encountered something that was not made, something that simply is. He had built a career on control, on the elegant, deliberate exercise of choosing who to be and how to be it. What he'd heard in those few backstage seconds was freedom. Years later, when people asked about that day, the people who were there would struggle to articulate what had made it different. What made it different was something that resisted description. The particular atmosphere of a voice that arrives from somewhere real and goes somewhere real. That doesn't perform emotion so much as carry it across an open space and set it down in the chests of strangers. 82,000 strangers that afternoon. And one artist standing in the wings who had spent 20 years learning how to construct exactly what he was watching someone else simply be. He never forgot it. She never stopped doing it. And the afternoon itself, that gold July light over Wembley, that summer that felt like a hinge in history, stayed with everyone who was there, the way certain days do, the way certain voices do, the kind that don't let go.